Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
So the setup of this presentation is that I'm going to present first on a little bit of fair housing law. So we're going to talk about some laws that govern hate and harassment according to HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And then my colleague here, Ariane, is going to be talking about some good conflict resolution skills that are tried and true, and he can say they're tried and true because he's been doing this for quite some time and he has seen and heard a lot and worked through a lot with folks. So I want to talk a little bit about the organization I work for, the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Just out of curiosity, how many people have heard of us? Ooh, how many people haven't? Okay, so for the folks brave enough to admit you haven't, I love that you raised your hand. And by the end of the presentation that I do, you'll understand a little bit more about our organization and how we can support the work that you all do. So we are a statewide civil rights organization. So fair housing law is actually civil rights law, and it's civil rights law that pertains specifically to housing. And we are statewide. We have employees in Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon, Central Oregon, the North and Central Coastal region, the Portland metro area, and the Portland team covers all the way down to Eugene. So literally, we cover the entire state of Oregon. Our mission at the Fair Housing Council is to end illegal housing discrimination and ensure equal access to fair housing and housing choice. So how we do that work, we have 3 different departments. So one department is the education department. We do a lot of education outreach statewide, and we are doing that with everyone across the board. So we are doing that with jurisdictional bodies, so governmental bodies. We're doing that with housing providers, nonprofit housing providers, for-profit housing providers, shelter providers, everybody. We're also doing it with advocates, so educating advocates so they have a better understanding of what housing discrimination might look like for the folks that they're working with, and also protections under the Fair Housing Act, so how to advocate for clients. And then we are also educating consumers. So what we know is that if we are trying to ensure equal access to housing and housing choice, we literally need everybody across the board knowing and understanding what these laws are. We also have an enforcement program because the education doesn't always work. So we have an enforcement team where people can contact our hotline to report if they believe that they have experienced housing discrimination. We also do some public policy work as well, where we are working towards making systemic change to making communities more inclusive. Okay, so the objectives for the first portion of this. My hope is that by the end of this presentation, you will have a very basic understanding about what fair housing law is and the implications of fair housing law, specifically related to hate and harassment in housing. We're also going to review HUD guidance related to landlord responsibilities related to hate and harassment. And last, we're going to review conflict resolution basics with Ariane. So what is fair housing? So fair housing is the right of all people to be free from illegal discrimination in the rental, sale, or financing of housing. So literally in any type of housing transaction. And I want us to have a shared definition of discrimination as you hear me use that word. So discrimination means treating a person differently in any type of a housing transaction, and a person is getting treated differently because of their protected identity. So the term for protected identity is protected class, but because of a person's protected identity. We know that there are certain groups of people that are more likely to be discriminated against in every aspect of life, and of course, housing is no different. So we have different protected identities on the federal level. Oregon adds state protections, and then also some local jurisdictions will add additional protections. So if there's anyone here from the state of Washington, you may have some different protections in the state of Washington. Actually, I know that you do have some different ones, but the federal protections that I talk about and the HUD guidance related to hate and harassment still are part of Washington as well. So let's talk about these protected classes. So on the federal level, in 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was passed, race, color, religion, and national origin were the first 4 protected classes that were added. Then in 1974, as part of the women's movement, which had been going on for quite some time at that point, 1974, we see sex being added as a protected class. Initially, sex actually meant sex at birth. It has been expanded, though, to now where it includes sexual orientation and gender identity, and that is now on a federal level. That didn't change on a federal level, though, until this current presidential administration, right? Interesting to know that. Now, the protected class of sex also includes survivors of domestic violence, because the majority of survivors of domestic violence identify as women or femme. Oregon landlord-tenant law also adds additional protections for survivors of domestic violence. So if you're not familiar with those, I highly recommend that you check those out. Really important to know. And also people who do not identify as women or femme still get those protections as survivors of domestic violence. Now, in 1988, we see 2 additional protected classes being added with the Fair Housing Amendments Act. We see familial status, meaning families with children. Okay, so think about this. Prior to 1988, it was totally legal for landlords to say, I won't rent to you because you have children. In the state of Oregon, nearly 70% of landlords would not rent to families with children. So think about how hard it would be to find safe, stable, affordable rental housing if 70% of the market is off limits to you, right? We can pull up statistics like that for literally any one of these groups, which is why we have these protections in the first place, okay? We see disability also added in 1988. So the independent living movement had been happening for several decades. Some of us in this room, me included, might remember that Reagan was the president and we were seeing institutional settings also being closed down. And so people moving into the community, not having equal access to housing choice. So we see the Americans with Disabilities Act is passed in 1988, as well as the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which added additional protections and accessibility provisions for people with disabilities in 88. Also part of that 1988 Amendment Act, it added the ability for organizations like ours, the Fair Housing Council, to do testing, fair housing testing. So that's like we send out secret shoppers with sort of secret identities, right? And we're just trying to figure out, does a housing provider treat one person differently? So maybe we get a call on our hotline where it's a mixed race couple. And they're saying, this landlord said they wouldn't rent to us, or the landlord got really chilly with us when he realized that we were a mixed race couple. We might send out 2 groups, right? A white couple and then a mixed race couple. And we have their secret identities, say the same things related to, like, you know, credit, rental history, their spiel is the same. The only thing that's different is, you know, that protected identity. And we're gonna see how is the housing provider treating the people similarly or differently. If you are interested in being a tester, we are always looking for testers also. You like that sales pitch, right? So we are always looking for testers, especially representative of folks that are contacting us on our hotline. So if you're interested in being a tester, please come up and talk to me afterwards. So let's talk about the state protected classes. So Oregon adds marital status. So if somebody is married, single, widowed, or divorced, shouldn't matter in a housing transaction. Source of income is also protected. Source of income means specifically housing subsidies, right? So Section 8, agency rent payments. TANF, SSI, and SSD are not expressly listed in the law, but the legislative intent was to include all types of benefits that help cover basics. So we know of cases that have settled on behalf of complainants who were discriminated against because of having TANF or SSI or SSDI. Also in Oregon, for quite some time, sexual orientation and gender identity has been protected. So adding it on a federal level doesn't change a lot for the laws here in the state of Oregon. Now, different jurisdictions will go on to add additional protections. So for example, Portland and Beaverton add age over 18 and also type of occupation. We also see those added in Salem, as well as housing status. So basically, history of homelessness is protected in the jurisdiction of Salem. In Eugene, we see things like domestic partnership and ethnicity added as well. So different jurisdictions may have additional protections. So I'm going to shift gears now, and we're going to talk about specifically harassment in housing. So harassment in rental communities and HOA governed communities. There's very clear guidance from HUD around this. Now, also, there are other pieces of the law that touch on this. So we do have landlord tenant laws that say that people have the right to peaceful enjoyment of their housing. Also, here's the HUD ruling, section 818 from Federal Fair Housing Law, and this came out September of 2016. And what this guidance from HUD says is that harassment that is based on somebody's protected class or their protected identity violates civil rights laws. And it went on to say that a landlord or an HOA is responsible for investigating and actually taking action in those cases of harassment if the harasser and the harassee are both residents. So both tenants or both members of that community. So unfortunately, let's say that there's a person that lives in an apartment complex and next door is a homeowner, and that homeowner is harassing the person in the apartment complex. This guidance doesn't touch on that situation because it's not the same housing provider. The person still has rights, the person still can file a claim, the person still can get an attorney around those things, they still have those rights, but it's just handled in a different way than if they had the same landlord. What we know is that there is an increase in acts of hate and harassment. Now, we started seeing an increase in acceleration in acts of hate and harassment as of November of 2016. I'm not going to tell you what happened in November of 2016, but it's going to happen this November too, right? So we see an increase, and this is tracked by the Southern Poverty Law Center as well as other organizations. We have also seen an increase of what is being reported to our organization. We thought that at some point that acceleration would slow down, and it has not slowed down. It has continued. Many of the targets of these acts of hate and harassment are immigrants, refugees, Muslims, African American people, Jewish people, women, folks who are part of the LGBTQIA+ community, right? So those are often the targets. Almost 1/3 of all acts of hate and harassment happen in people's homes. We have lots of historical evidence that shows when people are getting harassed and they are part of these protected classes, that it impacts the community as a whole. We see entire groups of people moving out of communities as a result of these acts of hate and harassment. So hate and harassment is absolutely a fair housing issue. Also, only 1 in 15 acts of hate ever get reported. So I want you to look back at that list of who gets targeted, and oftentimes those groups that are getting targeted do not have good relationships with law enforcement or the bodies that they should be reporting that hate and harassment to. So if somebody is experiencing hate and harassment in housing, you can contact us. We are a reporting agency. We are not the government. We are a nonprofit, a private nonprofit organization, and we are not the police department. So we are a resource there. So let's talk a bit about different forms of harassment. It could be words, especially if it's threats or it's continuing. Oftentimes what we will see is that it will start out as a threat and then it will continue to grow over time. It could be actions like spying, touching, leaving derogatory messages on cars. It could also be harassment that is done digitally. So emails, texts, social media. So when I'm presenting this section to housing providers, I'm really clear that they are not expected to become friends with all of their tenants on social media, right? To police what is happening. However, if somebody is experiencing hate and harassment, they need to be doing things like taking screenshots, right? Creating a paper trail or evidence. So an organization like ours or HUD or BOLI can actually do some investigation around it. So if you're working with somebody that's experiencing hate and harassment, please talk to them about creating some type of a list or a log of what's happening, date, time, who's involved, the effect of that harassment, It helps to create that paper trail. And then if there's anything like, notes or screenshots, recordings, things like that, those can be really helpful. It could also be doing things like displaying hate symbols, like swastikas, for example. In most cases, it's more than one incident, but a severe incident also qualifies. And again, there has been a national uptick in harassment against protected classes that we have not seen, start to diminish yet. Now, I want to be clear that not all harassment that happens in housing is a fair housing issue, okay? So one example. This is a real story. We were doing a training in Southern Oregon for a housing provider group. And they said, we have 2 residents that hate each other. It's not based on one of these protected identities. I mean, they're not harassing each other or calling them names based on protected identities, but these 2 older women, they just go at it. They just yell at each other. It was like, well, if it's not based on protected class, it's not a fair housing issue. The landlord, kind of sat on his hands and didn't do anything. And so then ultimately it culminated in an argument in the laundry room where one of these older women threw a full bottle of laundry detergent at the other older woman, right? So maybe not the best idea to sit on hands. However, it wasn't fair housing because they weren't bringing protected class into it. Now, had they been mentioning, race, had they been mentioning religion, disability, those types of things, then it could be related to protected class. Her son took my son's bike, right? Not necessarily a fair housing issue unless her son is taking my son's bike and her son has been acting this way and we are the only Jewish family that lives in this neighborhood, right? Then it becomes likely a fair housing issue. His dog pooped on my front lawn, that could just be a really bad neighbor, right? Now, if it's he lets his dog poop on my lawn and he's made comments about the fact that I'm part of, the queer community, then it could be possibly related to fair housing. Okay, so I want you to answer this for me. When is harassment a fair housing issue? Oh, you all get gold stars. You're fair housing superstars. Okay, when it's based on protected class, exactly. So harassment based on protected class. I'm going to go through some examples of this, and some of these examples are actually real, and I'll expand a little bit on them. Ooh, I got too excited there. Hold on. I know. Call me Speedy. Okay, here we go. I know. Arion's like, take as much time as you can, please. I'll say this, normally for this presentation, we've done it a few times, but we've only gotten like 50 minutes, so this feels like so luxurious. We're like an hour and 15, woo. If we get done early though, it's lunch after this, so they won't be mad at us. Okay, so sexual harassment. If it's happening in housing, it's a fair housing issue because it's harassment based on the protected class of sex. Now, remember the dog poop example from earlier? Another example of dog poop where it is a fair housing issue. This was a lesbian couple that lived in Florida, and their neighbor cleaning up the poop of the dog and then literally leaving it on this lesbian couple's front stoop, right? And had been harassing them as well about other things, about being lesbian outside of just the poop incident. Now, before my time working at the Fair Housing Council, I worked for 14 years at an organization called Cascade AIDS Project, working with folks living with HIV and AIDS, worked in their housing program, and I also taught tenant education as part of that. I had somebody that came through my class, and he said, I am getting harassed by my neighbors. And they said, okay, tell me about this. And he said, I've been telling my landlord that my neighbors are harassing me, but they're calling me all kinds of names because I'm gay. They're yelling them at me. They're throwing trash on my balcony. Somebody peed on my front door. Somebody took a baseball bat to the windshield of my truck. And I am reporting this to the landlord, and the landlord is doing absolutely nothing. So that was the point where I said, hey, would you mind if I call the Fair Housing Council? Because I had said, maybe you ought to call the Fair Housing Council, and he had enough things that he was trying to deal with, right? The emotional toll of hate and harassment. And I said, would it be okay with you then if I call the Fair Housing Council for you? Because you can do that as a service provider, call on behalf of your client. So I called, and they said, yeah, this really sounds like a fair housing issue. So then he was willing to connect with them. He had a housing voucher. So they were the folks that answered the hotline, they were able to negotiate to get him out of his lease and also work with the housing authority so he could keep his voucher and move it to another place. And then after the fact, he went back and he got a settlement for $20,000. Now, is it the neighbors that pay for that? No, it's the landlord. It's the landlord specifically because the landlord did not enforce this individual's fair housing rights. Because people have the right to live without hate or harassment in housing. You will hear people say, well, what about my First Amendment right? But to be very clear, First Amendment right does not protect making another person feel or be unsafe in their home. Plain and simple. Okay, this next case. This was harassing somebody with an assistance animal in a retirement community. This was a really odd case because it was a retirement community where the majority of residents were retired lawyers. So they know that there's laws around this, and they just, I mean, maybe because they're older, they're just like, I don't care. So the housing provider, the landlord, saw that this was becoming more and more of a problem. So proactively, the landlord brought the Fair Housing Council in to do a training and required residents to be at the training to reinforce the person's right to have an assistance animal. Now, the animal was like a small little dog that this woman would push around in a stroller. So it wasn't like the dog wasn't under control. So it was a very odd kind of case. There was a man, this case I believe came out of Colorado. There was a man that had been in a motorcycle accident, and as a result of that motorcycle accident, it affected his mobility and the way that he spoke. And he was getting made fun of by the kids in the apartment complex. And he's reporting it to the landlord, and the landlord saying, oh, kids are just gonna be kids. But who's responsible for the kids' behavior? Parents, right? Parents. So that landlord is supposed to be holding the parents accountable for the kids' behavior, and the landlord's not doing that. This gentleman went for a swim in the community pool that was there, and the kids stole his wallet, his keys, his shoes, his shirt, his towel, his phone, everything. That's the point where he lawyered up, and that settled for $160,000. Right? The next one, this was from an HOA community. There was an African-American woman that was living in that community. She was experiencing intense racial and sexual harassment from another resident, and she reported that to the HOA, and they were saying, oh, nothing we can do, nothing we can do. That was a $550,000 settlement. Now, I will say this, it is really hard to prove hate and harassment. That's why it becomes even more important for people to have written records, logs, proof, things like that of what is happening. Okay, so what should a landlord do? A landlord learns of the harassment, and then the landlord should investigate and take action. They have to do at least enough investigation to figure out, is this related to fair housing? Is this related to a protected identity? So how does that landlord find out what's going on? The landlord should be looking at any kind of paper trail or evidence that the tenant is providing. It might be like one person's word against another. So then are there other things like people that witnessed it that the landlord can be interviewing as to what happened? I heard one person say, a resident services coordinator say, we have video cameras in the hallways. It doesn't record the sound, but it records video, and we could see the body language, and it was really clear who was the perpetrator, who was doing the harassing, and who was the victim in that situation, right? And how does a landlord know if there's a fair housing issue? Again, if it's related to protected class. Now, the landlord should also be documenting every step of the way. If the landlord fails to document, then they have not done their due diligence under this guidance. Because if this ever went to investigation or court, the landlord needs to be able to show that they have done due diligence to investigate. If they can't prove that, then they start taking on legal liability of the harassment themselves. So if the harassment is not a fair housing issue, this is where, Arion's specialties really come on. So it might be the role of the housing provider. They might ignore the dispute, but like with that laundry room argument, probably not the best idea. Mediation, right, could be a great, great tool. We did this presentation 2 weeks ago, and there was a housing provider that came up afterwards, and she said, I went to the presentation last year, And we ended up using mediation services because we had two residents that just would scream and yell at each other, and it's causing problems for everybody. And then we sent them, we worked with mediation with them, and they created an agreement. And when the one person realized that she was not going to be able to hold up her end of the bargaining or the bargain of that agreement, she had signed on to it, she chose to move out without problem, right? So mediation can be a really, really powerful tool. That landlord, the housing provider, could have consequences for one or both parties, or maybe use a combination of strategies. So if the harassment is a fair housing issue, again, the landlord should take prompt corrective action, giving warnings, notices to the perpetrator. So for example, let's say that a resident replaces their window treatment with swastika curtains. The landlord should then do something like give a notice to everybody that says you have to use the window treatments that were provided at move-in. Or sometimes in rental agreements, you will see something that says, like a provision that says, no signs, flags allowed to be displayed, or signs being displayed outside of a person's unit. And it's specifically to try to stave off things like this. Housing providers should be documenting every step of the way, and they should also be following up with the victim to make sure that whatever action that they have taken has been effective. If they fail to act, it's actually considered a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So landlord responsibilities, this is actually language from that ruling in 2016. Corrective action may include verbal and written warnings, enforcing lease provisions to move, evict, or otherwise sanction tenants who harass or permit guests to harass. Housing providers should follow up to make sure that the corrective action was effective. And lastly, liability arises when the person or entity knew or should have known that a resident was harassing another resident and yet did not take prompt corrective action and end it. So let's talk about that should have known. It could be that the housing provider is getting a report from the resident directly. It could be that it's the neighbor of the resident that reports what's happening. It could be that it's a caseworker or advocate. It could be that it's a friend or family member that dropped by and saw it. It could be that it's a maintenance staff that actually witnessed the event. And maybe if they didn't report it, right? Well, the housing provider should have known because the maintenance staff should have reported it. So preventing harassment. It's advisable that housing providers have resident-on-resident harassment policies and review those at move-in. And it is also suggestible for landlords to use tools like newsletters to educate tenants about harassment policies and also how to report. Now, for more resources around fair housing, please go to our website, fhco.org. We have a huge resource library. Also, for anyone that is a housing provider here, we have a housing provider information education line that housing providers can contact via email. We're not allowed to give legal advice. I should just make that disclaimer. But housing providers could, email and say like, hey, what would happen if I have two residents that are harassing each other? What would I do? And my colleague that answers that line would be like, here's the 2016 guidance for you to read, right? So we try to really empower housing providers to follow fair housing as well. Any questions about the fair housing portion? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, when does deferred maintenance become an actual issue of fair housing, right? It's getting deferred, it's getting deferred, it's getting deferred. There's documentation around that. So if it falls outside of a reasonable amount of time to fix it, and the law is not always clear about reasonable amounts of time, but if it falls outside of a reasonable amount of time, let's say that it's, that housing provider has maintenance staff available to do that kind of work, and they're not, and it's making the unit uninhabitable, reasonable amount of time would be much shorter, right? So it's not really a cut and dry. When might it become harassment? Well, oftentimes when we hear about a tenant that's reported that landlord for a fair housing violation, That's the type of harassment we'll see, where the landlord stops providing equal services to that household as a result. So should that happen, I would highly recommend that somebody contacts our hotline. Our hotline is open for phone calls from 9 to noon on Tuesdays, and otherwise can be accessed through our website 24 hours a day. Thank you. Yeah, so bully came out, did report it, maintenance got done very quickly. Funny how that happens. I saw a hand over here. Oh, that's a great question. So he was talking about the difference between protected classes on the state and federal level, and how Oregon has really been more proactive about adding additional protected classes. Do we see anything on the horizon for the federal level? I have heard some talk about adding source of income specifically. Biden had been talking about adding source of income as a protected class. And I heard a little bit about that, but then I haven't heard much about it since. But I would hope in the next, 4 years that we would see that added as a protected class. Okay, one more question and then I'm going to pass it. Oh. Right. So the clarification question is around the statement I made around, like, is maintenance available or not available? Like, when is that? So that's really more around sort of trying to gauge what's reasonable versus not reasonable in responding to a request, as far as identifying this might be related to fair housing, right? Maybe the landlord has made comments about, oh, your kids are destroying everything, so we're not fixing stuff, right? So it becomes a fair housing issue if there's something like that protected class in play. There are landlord tenant laws that govern the rental process when it comes to habitability of a home, and there are guidelines set out. So OregonLawHelp.org is a great website. It's for Oregon Law Center, OregonLawHelp.org. They have a landlord tenant law handbook that is really, it's well written, it's easy to understand. Okay, I'm going to do one more question, and then I'm going to pass the mic. He doesn't want to get the mic. He's like, take up all the time. And I'm like, yeah. I feel like so the question is, like, the two older women arguing in the laundry room, right? And one person feels victimized. The other person also probably feels victimized as well. But when do you really suss out what action needs to be taken? If it's fair housing related, that's where I would step in and say, like, landlord might need to do things like give notices to both parties to be really clear about what the lease provisions say around behavior in a community. But what I will say is, I'm going to put a pause on you, because Ariane is going to talk a lot more about also conflict resolution and kind of working through some of those types of situations. Yeah. Okay, are you ready?
I just started presenting last year, so I'm not a good presenter. Uh, I was no, I was that classmate that if you gave me the bare minimum, I did that, and then it cost the group. So now it's catching up to me. So yeah, this presentation will be the conflict management and de-escalation. I'm better at showing rather than telling, so I apologize in advance. I'll talk a little bit about my background and then communication, breakdown, de-escalation, and finding resolution. Our organization, Resolutions Northwest, we focus on equity mediation, which I think is important when you're dealing with housing. And equity-informed mediation is a form of mediation where the mediators are aware of the systemic and internal unjust dynamics and will actively address these as they arise in a room. So obviously we're dealing with a power balance in this situation. Just you're the property manager, you have the control, and then there's a tenant, and then obviously race, ability, able-bodied, income, all of that comes into play every time they walk in the room. Yeah, so more than the communication, a lot of times I talk about what's going to happen before they walk in the room, right? Most people have a safe space or a trauma, and so they're coming in with whatever's baggage they have prior to seeing you. So they're already upset. They're coming into the office, whatever's going on, but they have other issues that they don't know how to compartmentalize or they've comprised before they even seen you. One of the questions I usually ask is, what are some of the reasons you think we have communication breakdown, just in general? Yeah, absolutely. Empathizing. Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of people that hear you, but they're not listening, right? And they're already jumping to response. Yeah, the tenant is already ready to make a stance. This is what I want. The property manager is like, this is all I'm giving them, so I'm not going to listen. That happens a lot. Even out, and I'll watch it sometimes. I just watch these things brew up. Um, and then a lot of times we have our own issues, which I'll talk about. We have we're past the pandemic, but that was one of the issues. Just minimal. Someone's wearing a mask, the other person doesn't like it. I mean, that's still a conversation. Believe it or not, a tenant will say, "I don't see why they're wearing a mask in the office." It has nothing to do with the tenant, but they're walking in with this attitude already that whatever political side you're on, they're dealing with that. What they see on TV, what we see in social media. I'm starting to learn about this algorithm thing where if you like something on Instagram, everything now comes towards you that you've already agreed with or liked. So now you start believing everything you say is right. And the influencers. We're not seeing them as much now, but those movements that we saw, the BLMs, the rights, when tenants hear tenant rights, they believe everything they say is right at this point. I get everything I want. They don't really understand rights, but they're just going to say that word every time because they believe, they hear the word, oh, I have rights. And it's, well, no, you can't just let your dog poop there. But they'll say, I'm disabled. I can't get that far, so I should be able to let the dog poop right here. And then they want you to build a little dog area. So that's what they believe rights is. And then their responsibilities. That usually comes and goes because, as you know, different property managers will allow tenants to do things that the new one or the new owners won't allow, so they get confused. And then, as the guy said in the back, there's a lack of empathy and communication skills. I've met a lot of you all. I think we all have it, but sometimes, like I said, it's not how you respond; it's what's walking into the room. So here's a picture someone gave me. It's a face or side of face, and it has 7 points. Can you see? Okay, the top left says, "Who are we empathizing with?" So with landlord tenant, we're dealing with a tenant, but what's their issue, right? Is it their income? Because a lot of times they think you're judging them based on not having income, or they're on a government subsidy. Are they disabled? Because right, if they don't get something, they're going to assume, as she said, everybody's going to use their identity at some point during that conversation. Uh, who do? Well, I can't even read it myself. What do we want for them to do? Right? Obviously, it's them to calm down, probably, or want them to sign the ledger. The ledger is very confusing for a lot of tenants. I spend a lot of time there's it's not a math problem, but that's how they see it. And if they didn't understand math, that's we spend hours, and then I'll send them back to you all, or I'll sit in the room. But if it's something like that, or we need the maintenance person to go in their house, and we don't know why they won't let them in the house. What do they see? So believe it or not, I've talked to some property owners, and some people have made changes. But when you're wearing a suit, they take it as authority right off the bat, right? So I've had tenants, and I'm only using examples that I hear a lot, where tenants say, "Why do they have to wear a suit? Why do they think they're better than me?" And I was like, "Could that be just a job requirement?" They don't see it that way. And on a side note, I also volunteer with victims of human trafficking, and I do a offender dialogue, offender victim dialogue. So we work with people who've been victims of crimes, and then the person in prison. And if they see a suit, right? So their father was in the military, they've been in trouble their whole life. Everybody in the suit has been authority, has been abusive. So now when they come into the office, they're already triggered. This person has a suit, they're going to try to demand things or they're going to make me uncomfortable. What are they saying? A lot of times I just suggest people to, they're going to repeat the same thing in different ways. And that's what they're trying to get out. They're not upset necessarily. They just want you to hear something that they want you to repeat, right? So if they're, I'll use the hoarding for example. So if you keep saying you can't hoard, we got to get through your apartment, but they're saying I'm just collecting things. Yeah, you just have. I've learned taking a hoarding. I take a lot of classes based off of what tenants and property managers tell me. If you repeat to them, okay, I understand you like to collect things, but how can we make it so we have access? They'll calm down and say, okay, they understand that I'm collecting. I'm not a hoarder, and then we can work this together. So a lot of times I just repeat back to what they've said to me. Even after an hour of whatever else they said, I'll just go back to a couple words and they'll feel appreciated. What do they do? So if they're pacing back and forth, are they yelling? Are they quiet? Then they don't want you to always match their energy. They just want you to respond accordingly. So sometimes they will pace, but that's normal for them because they've always been in a heightened situation. Maybe they yell or they swear, but that's probably the environment that they grew up in, and it's normal for them to have someone with an escalated voice or swearing. And that, I mean, I don't suggest people tone police, but if you can get past a few swear words, you may be okay. But if you don't like it, then yes, you can definitely let them know that profanity is not going to help. And then what are they hearing from you? Are you just flat out saying, I'm not going to do it? Or are they hearing that you're trying to work with them? Hey, let's go over a few options. Or yes, we could do that, but if other requirements happen. Or maybe it's, yeah, I don't, maybe it's just you want them to let the maintenance in the room. That's usually some of the issues I have with maintenance. They're like, I don't want anything from the tenant. I don't even want to talk to them. I just need to fix this leak before it gets worse. So we can kind of focus on that leak with them. Like it'll cost us $8,000 or you'll have to get a hotel and you know they don't want to get a hotel. So kind of respond to what their needs. And then how are they thinking or feeling? Did they come in with attitude? It's probably something in their home that's already caused a problem. And what are they gaining from this conversation? Did they gain the fact that you're willing to work with them or that you'll follow up with them? A lot of tenants like to follow up. That's their biggest. They feel that you appreciate them or that you'll treat them as a person if you say, yes, I'll send you a follow-up email or I'll let you know when it's been ordered. Common things that landlords or property managers say or do to make it worse. I don't like to tell people what to say, but no is definitely a word I've learned a long time ago. Is the worst thing you can say to anyone. I don't know why I grew up with the no's in the house, but I think working at a prison release program 20 years ago and with special needs, I wouldn't say no to any of them. I would probably joke with them to kind of get out of whatever they were asking for, but I've found other ways to say, well, legally I can't do that, or that's not in our job requirements. That's something else we can't do. Sometimes you just want to say no. You're tired. You're upset. You've repeated the same statement, but sometimes people are looking for triggers. It's a weird thing, but they want to get upset so they can then get upset at you, and then we go through this whole problem. So those are one of the things, or suggesting that the tenant move. Now, maybe that is the best idea, but remember your position is more like telling them to do it. It doesn't matter how open you say, hey, have you thought about moving? Or we have this great option. You can move to another unit. And they'll call me and say, the landlord demanded that I move and I want to file a lawsuit. We don't do legal at our side, but it's just your position. It's not who you are. It's just who's it coming from, right? Where if your friend said, hey, I want you to move out, you could take it different rather than your mother, like, you're 18, it's time to go. So that's how they kind of responded, said, I don't know who they think they are. They're talking to me like my dad. They told me to move. And the landlord shows me the email that just said, hey, I think you should move. I don't think you're happy here. So they just receive it different. So sometimes it's just being more with certain like things like that, just giving them options reduces the tension. Um, Also, not using their background or as a reason to get upset with them. So sometimes landlords will get upset and then say, you know, you're the one that's not working, or you're the one that seemed to break everything, or you've gone through all these properties, haven't you figured it out? Like if you return the favor to them, it's just going to escalate things. So and it's easy to do when you're upset, but just remember, take that pause. I tell a lot of people to pause. In mediation, I've had landlords, as Charles heard, say it's not my fault. You can't keep a man to pay your rent. That was in the middle of a mediation. And I was not prepared. Usually, I kind of know what people are going to say, what's their triggers, and it shut down the whole mediation. I've had landlords say, "I don't want your boyfriend back at this apartment," and so what I do a lot of times, if something is said out of pocket, I just freeze. I just won't say anything. Sometimes people need that minute to reflect on what they just said, and that's maybe they'll apologize, or I'll just split the mediation and we'll work separate. But if you can, if you know something could be offensive, just take a break before you say it, even if it's 10 seconds. A lot of things that tenants bring up are, you know, being told that the maintenance is coming. They have an issue with maintenance, right? They may have had some personal issue in the past, and this maintenance, he bangs at the door. I personally don't like when people bang at the door, right? I'm like, who the heck is at my door right now? And they've said a lot of times it triggered another male that came to their door the same way in the past. And if the landlord, if the maintenance has a suit that, or not wearing a suit, I know sometimes people just wear these denim shirts and jeans, and that was the same person that came to their room years ago. So they're kind of timid now every time that someone has to come to their home, or they're not clean. So a lot of times they just want you to work with them. Let's schedule a time. Let's set a date. Just give me an advance. Um, when a property manager feels that they should have understood the ledger, like I said earlier, that seems to be an issue. They don't quite understand the ledger, especially if they're working with, a lot of times tenants will have rental assistance or utility assistance. And if your ledger is the kind where whenever the money comes in, we're just applying it to something, right? The old backdated rent, utilities, they don't understand that it's not going towards the utilities, and so they can't get utility assistance, and they want to move the rental assistance. As confusing as you just heard it, that's what I have to deal with every day. So just know that if you told them 5 times and they don't understand it, they really don't. It's at this point you might need someone else to help you, or call our agency. This is what we do a lot. Most of my mediators are trauma informed, so they're more patient than me. So setting the stage, yeah, I get impatient a lot, especially when it's hot. There's nothing funny. I don't want to talk. What do you want? So setting the stage. A lot of times when they walk in, they're we all do it. A lot of us. Some of us have heightened security. Some of us don't. Right? Like I grew up in the Bay Area, a pretty bad neighborhood. I'm always scanning for safety. That's just how I grew up. And now that I'm disabled, I'm more alert. And so a lot of tenants are also coming in. They're looking for the scene. They're wondering who they're talking to, and they walk in and your arms are crossed, right? They already feel you're on the offensive. So a lot of times you have a stare on your face, right? You're upset. You give them this glare, and a lot of property managers don't understand. And sometimes we'll do this little practice that we could do now, where I want you to face somebody next to you, and one person tells an open story, one of their best moments of a gift exchange, and then the other person, I just want you to stare at them with just a nasty stare, and then we'll switch after a minute. And I just want to hear responses, because this is what tenants say. The look that this person had before I even talked to them, I didn't even want to talk. I didn't want to respond. I don't know what they want. So, and the property manager was like, "Well, I was in a bad mood." Well, the tenant now is in a bad mood, and now we have to start over. So yeah, look at someone next to you and choose a person to tell the story, and then the other person, just give them the worst look you can. Don't say anything, just look at them. Yeah. It's a lot of laughing for some serious faces. Okay, we're doing pretty good. Yeah. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I was having a hard time understanding you a little while back. Remember, we are interpreting back there.
Okay. Okay. All right, folks. I heard way too much giggling back there. Some of y'all weren't taking this too serious. So I would like for everyone to switch. So the person who listened now, can you switch?
Check as best you can.
Okay.
Also ask him if he can turn up the volume, if that's a possibility.
Wait, are we to 11:30? Okay. Cool. Oh, just yeah. She'll find that gap. Okay. All right. I don't know how to call it here.
All right, folks, it's time to bring attention back up here. All right, folks, it's time to bring attention to the front of the room. There we go.
That was great. So how did that feel? Anybody want to talk about? Because I heard way too much laughing. So I don't, I don't think the tenants were laughing when they called me and say she was staring me down. Yeah, you scared them off. Yeah, a lot of times they don't know what to do. They freeze up and they just say, "Well, do I even talk about the issue, or do I talk about your appearance?" That's what they've told me. Anybody else have any? Nah, they should definitely call you out. Well, yeah. So that little example is what tenants experience, right? When they, or even the vice versa. You see a tenant coming and they got that look on their face. You're like, oh, not again. Like we didn't have this same conversation, and it's just very uncomfortable. So we can try to talk about how to be more, look more open when the tenant comes in. Um, Obviously, if you can have open space in your room, I know some property managers have done that where it's not that tight space where we walk in and they can barely fit and it's hot and the doors are closed. If the less furniture you can have, the more spacious they feel, the more relaxed. And that's just in general, right? Not even a tenant. If you've ever had to go to your boss's office, usually I'm 6'6", so I was always looking over the cubicle. Like if he said come in, I'm like, nah, what you want, but but other times people just want the space. Uh, Starting the conversation as hard as it could be, and even just ending the conversation. A thank you, I appreciate you come. That goes a lot of way. A lot of tenants was like, yeah, the conversation went great. She said thank you. She was appreciative. Or sometimes the tenant will say, I don't know how it ended because they didn't say anything other than okay, or yes, I'll do it. So, but a lot of times when they hear those things, they're more relaxed and they're at least going through our program, they're more open to listening. They're more open to resolving the conflict. Tone and body language, like I said, a lot of that is, are you looking at them in the eyes? Are you crossing your arms? I know that's comfort for a lot of people, but it's discomfort for someone who's coming in. And I repeat it enough times, just remember the position of power makes all of those movements different. And then boundaries. Obviously, you want to talk about your boundaries with the tenant or anyone. You don't want them coming on this side of the table. Yelling too loud is uncomfortable. All of it. During and after the conversation, a lot of times is just how you respond is their biggest issue or conflict. And how do you respond? So I'm going to go through a little faster. In mediation, we use this acronym VEX, which is validate, empathize, clarify, and summarize. it can go, like I said, I do the bare minimum. So a lot of my mediators, they can, if you tell them a story or a couple words, you'll say, this is what happened. I was upset. We went through, and just tell them this 5-minute story. For me, I'll respond in 30 seconds with just what this vex. I'll say, oh, thank you for telling me what happened. I understand that this can be an uncomfortable situation. And let me just be clear, you need your washer fixed and we didn't get to you. And is this what we're working on? That was all of 30 seconds. They'll say, great, like you really listen. But I have mediators that can do a longer validation, a longer empathy. Um, they can clarify in a longer sentence and they can do a great summary. That's not my strength, but if you are good at that, that's what a tenant would like. And like I said, it could be as short as possible or it could be expanded, but they'll feel much better. And I'll just give you the tools that calms them down as you're talking to them. Uh, these are some phrases that they've heard that usually triggers them, right? Calm down. I'm not sure why this is a trigger phrase because I've heard it, when I was younger. Calm down makes sense, but I guess I don't know why people are upset. But no one wants to feel like you want them to calm down before you work with them, I guess is what they're looking at. So just think of other ways you can rephrase this, like, hey, let's relax for a second, or let's take a break before we get into this topic. Saying, I know how you feel. They'll never think you know how they feel, right? To tenants, you all make $10,000 a day. You're too rich for them. And this is just, they don't believe you'll ever agree. So avoiding, I know how you feel, and saying, I can understand where you're coming from is a great interpretation for them. Come with me. I'm not sure why people have said this, especially when there's tension, right? I'm not going to ask someone to come in the room, and I'm not going in that room. So, maybe saying, hey, let's set a time to talk. That we can kind of resolve this issue, or come back with the information you have, and we'll work on it, has been better than just saying, come with me. Finding resolution, asking why, either to them or in your head, why is this an issue? Why are they coming to me? A short explanation of the importance on the consequences. As I said with that leak, if we don't get to the leak, you may end up having to stay in a hotel, or it's going to cause more damage, and we may not have to relocate you. And if they got that corner building, they're not going to want to give it up. So sometimes say, hey, that building, that apartment, I know you like it, but if you don't let us in, this is what's going to happen. And they'll kind of say, okay, I need to work with that. Because a lot of times, if you just tell them what to do with no explanation, they feel left out. You can share your needs from both sides, right? Like, hey, I know you want us to work on this neighbor that's harassing you, but also I need you to not send as many emails. So in our mediation, we can work on these agreements on communication, by the way. So let's say you get a tenant calls a lot, they email a lot. We have made agreements that the tenants will agree to send one email within 3 days. But that's also with the property manager saying, I promise to respond in 72 hours. And so that has reduced a lot of conflict where the tenant said, okay, but they will email you on that 73rd hour, by the way. So try to keep as much as you can, but a lot of times if they know that you're working and you say, I need a window, they'll definitely give you that window. And ask what will work both of them. So if you can give them options, that's great. If you can say, hey, yeah, here's a few options, which one works best for you? Or here's a good time we can meet, what time works for you? If you cannot, it's okay to say, hey, legally, like for instance with drinking, legally you have to be 21 to drink, right? It's a straight law, not flexible. They're okay with that. And then establish your shared goals, right? I want you out the office. You want your windows fixed. I think we're in agreement, and they say yes. A lot of times, again, I keep repeating it, they just want to feel like you're working with them and not demanding from them. Even if you're doing your best, a lot of times, just the last time I'll say it, is that your position is where they're looking at, not who you are, but what you are. You don't want to be judged because if they've had 10 property managers and it's been bad for the last 9, you are going to be that same 10th person, right? It's horrible to have that feeling that you're being judged from someone else, but it's life, especially with property managers. You're in the toughest position that I've mediated for because you cannot escape your title or role with the tenants. And then just to kind of, we can do some questions if you have it, but here's our program. We're based out of Portland. It's free program, so I do suggest property managers and owners take advantage of it. So if, I know some places have resident service coordinators, but sometimes there's just the tenant that thinks that person works for the property. We have a lot of different mediators. So let's just say you call and say, Arion, they don't work well with men. I'll assign a female mediator or trans, LGBT, disabled. So we try to work with the tenants because if they're calm talking to us, then we can come back to you and say, hey, they're willing to work with you, or we need to mediate. And just quickly, how our mediation works, either side, any party can call us and say, hey, there's a conflict, we need help. We'll talk to both sides. I definitely try to minimize the conversation. I do have some mediators that'll talk a little longer to try to get things calm prior to mediation. And then we'll sit down, we'll ask you a question. We'll ask both parties, what brought you here today and what is your goal? And then we'll try to work through it. If it's something about an amount owed, we'll work through that balance together. If it's, this tenant is inappropriate or my property manager is having a problem with tenants, then we'll try to go through what is it they need and how do we move forward. So what ways can I communicate to my tenants that don't aggravate them? Or what can I get from my property manager when I need it? And how is that possible? And I'm downstairs, so if I have flyers, if you need it, if you want to share it with your tenants, and you can reach me directly. Yep. Uh-huh. Yeah. So there have been other neighboring mediation organizations now doing it as well. So you can, if you call or email me, I'll just forward it to you. Or if you have, I get callbacks because I deal with the difficult clients. So if you have like, no, this person's real difficult, but they're not getting evicted, that's probably somebody you'll send back to me because everyone else has tried. But yeah, we'll definitely find a neighboring one that you can start working with. And it should be free as well. Any other questions off the presentation? Yes? Yeah. Oh yeah, we definitely do that. Sometimes we'll ask the property manager or landlord to get involved at some point because when the tenants know now that we have to work it out, plus our property manager is viewing or somewhat, it helps a lot with the resolution. But yeah, if you have two tenants that are having conflict, you can definitely reach us. Yeah, any other questions for myself? Yes? Yeah. Yeah, the question was how to work with property managers and tenants if they're having a lot of conflict before you reach out to us. If it's a consistent complaints, I know one property did, what do you call it, like a town hall type of thing, right? You get the tenants together, you can facilitate it, we can, and just see what are the majority of the complaints and what's realistic. Like I know some properties have garden plots, right? And there's always fights over that. Well, let's figure out what the tenants need, how they can work with that, and what's reasonable with the property managers. Or just talking to some of those tenants that send multiple complaints and see what's reasonable. Because sometimes I know security is a complaint a lot we get, right? There's people, even if it's gated, tenants will let someone in. You can't really control that. But that is something maybe you can figure out, talk to the tenants about what would make you feel more secure. And yes, we could do that, or that's a little more difficult. But just hearing them out first and then say, we're working on it. But then there's just sometimes, as we know, there's just people that just, unless they see it, they're not going to agree. And then you can send them to us. If there's anything else, I think I can let y'all early for lunch. Thank you.
Gotcha.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I send information and raise information.